Welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Tomas Ocampo, Outreach Coordinator at Latin American Perspectives. Today we will be discussing the main theme of the July LAP issue, the impact of the Chilean earthquake of 2010, challenging the capabilities of the neoliberal state, with editor Kristen Sehnbruch. Kristen is the Director of Public Policy Institute at the University of Diego Portales in Chile, and an associate researcher and founding board member of the Center for Social Conflict and Cohesion, also in Chile, with responsibility for the Center's international relations. She is also a visiting senior fellow at the Department of International Development at the London School of Economics, and an affiliated lecturer at the Center for Latin American Studies at Cambridge University. Before this, she was a research fellow at the Department of Economics at the University of Chile and a lecturer and senior scholar at the University of California at Berkeley. Her research focuses principally on conceptualizing and measuring the quality of employment in developing countries and extends into Latin American labor markets, social policy, and development policy. Currently, she is also undertaking a large research project on informal political institutions at the macro, meso, and micro level in Chile. Her articles have been published by the Cambridge Journal of Economics, Development and Change, Latin American Perspectives, and the International Labor Review. She is the author of the book The Chilean Labor Market, a key to understanding Latin American markets, and with Peter Ciavelis, editor of Democratic Chile, The Politics and Policies of a Historic Coalition. Welcome, Kristen. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so for my first question, I'd like to ask if you can perhaps briefly summarize for our readers the theme of the July issue.
Well, the July issue is about the 2010 earthquake that happened in Chile on February 27th. It was an 8.8 magnitude earthquake. So as earthquakes go, that's one of the most significant high magnitude earthquakes that the history of the world has ever experienced. And it hit Chile in the south, as the southern region, south of Santiago, but it really extended across a very, very long stretch of the country. Approximately 600 miles of the country were affected by this earthquake. And I think it would be fair to say that most countries hit by an earthquake of this magnitude would suffer very, very significant damage and loss of life. The Chilean earthquake also suffered both of these, so there was significant loss of life through the earthquake itself. In addition to that, there was a very large tsunami, and unfortunately, the Chilean government didn't warn about that tsunami on time, so that cost a lot of lives. But in addition, of course, vast segments of the territory affected, infrastructure was affected by this earthquake, and in particular, some towns in the south of Chile were particularly badly damaged. The biggest among them was Concepcion, which is Chile's second city, along with Valparaiso. It's after the capital. It's one of the biggest cities in the country. And then towns around Concepcion in that area, such as Constitución, Talcahuano, other towns slightly further north, Talca, and also Chile's capital, Santiago, they were all very much affected by this earthquake. And so it was very interesting to study the government's response to this. I think it's fair to say that on the one hand, the resilience of Chile's infrastructure showed how well the country is prepared for an earthquake of this magnitude, even though it did suffer extensive damage, but pretty much the country was up and running again within 24 to 48 hours after the earthquake. We're talking about, of course, a long, thin country where the main artery is the central motorway that runs from north to south. And that was damaged in several places, and the government managed to get that up and running again within a relatively short period of time. That, of course, was absolutely crucial so that help could get to the affected regions. So I would say in terms of the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, the response was pretty effective if you consider how chaotic these situations generally are. I think we've had natural disasters even in developed countries where the response hasn't been as coordinated and as well organized. Having said that, of course, the people who are affected by the earthquake have a very, very different view of the government's response to the earthquake itself. They experienced the chaos firsthand, people who lost their houses and had nowhere to go, who had to live in emergency shelters for a long time, and then had to move into very precarious housing that was provided, often no more than wooden shacks in which entire families had to live. And so despite the immediate response to the earthquake, which I think was as well as it could have been in any country, it was the reconstruction process that followed and the policy through which the government then allocated benefits, new houses, etc., that showed the biggest deficiencies and really showed how a country that may be well prepared for earthquakes through its building codes, for example, that can prevent significant damage, is at the same time not particularly prepared for the reconstruction efforts that must follow such a natural disaster. And Chile is, of course, a country which suffers regularly, not only from earthquakes, but also from other natural disasters, and is also one of the countries that is in the top 10 of the world in terms of how it's going to be affected, how badly it's going to be affected by climate change. And climate change itself is also creating different and new types of natural disaster in Chile. So this is a country that suffers these events very, very regularly, and therefore prevention is, of course, a big part of the story, but so is the subsequent reaction to any kind of natural disaster. And I think in the aftermath of the Chilean earthquake of 2010, what became clear is that the Chilean state really isn't very prepared for dealing with any social, economic, or whatever type of emergency, and that in particular the structures and the mechanisms that the country had established over the years for dealing with social policies, for example, just simply weren't adequate for dealing with a natural disaster. So one of the articles in the special issue, for example, is about how these social policy structures were used in order to allocate, for example, housing benefits or other benefits to people who were affected by the earthquake. And Chile is, of course, one of the most neoliberal countries in the history of the world, and very much has a sort of neoliberal state that's based on minimal social welfare capability and institutions. And so it became quite clear that these institutions were ill-equipped for dealing with a disaster. So, for example, the idea of targeting benefits may be a way of allocating resources in a reasonably efficient way under normal circumstances, but it's not a reasonable way for allocating them in a post-disaster scenario. And these things really affected how the state dealt with the disaster itself. It also involved, as much as possible, the private sector in the reconstruction efforts, and there was a definite lack of coordination between, let's say, government help, private help, NGOs, people working on the ground, civil organizations, civil society, etc. And again, this is not a state that has had a long-standing tradition of dialogue with civil society, with NGOs, etc. And so all of this came out. I think one of the issues with disasters or with any kind of crisis is that it brings the latent weaknesses that are in the background out into the foreground. And so therefore all of these structures in the aftermath of the earthquake kind of broke down, or the lack of coordination became very evident. And basically the Chilean government didn't respond very well in the reconstruction process. The reconstruction process was quite chaotic. It was, as I said, badly coordinated. There were some cases, very significant cases of corruption. And for a very long time, people were simply housed in very, very precarious conditions. And it took probably too long to rehouse them and allocate benefits in a more appropriate way.
You mentioned in the introduction that one of the articles discusses the failure of decentralized master plans that were meant to guide reconstruction. Can you perhaps talk about the reconstruction efforts after the earthquake and the lack of coordination between the public and private sectors?
Yeah, so the idea was to set up these master plans for the reconstruction of the most affected towns that had been damaged. And these master plans, the idea was to bring together the private sector, civil society, and government help in setting up these reconstruction efforts. There were a couple of cases where the master plans sort of worked reasonably well, even though they were criticized afterwards for lack of participation of the local population and some corruption, etc. But in some cases they functioned. In most cases, actually, they didn't function at all, just simply because this is not a government and this is not a society that is used to any kind of long-term planning. And so a master plan that just simply rebuilds what was there before in a country which is still very much a developing country, especially in the regions outside of Santiago, in smaller towns, etc. That just rebuilds. If you just try to rebuild what was there before without giving a new impetus for development in those regions, or without rebuilding things in a better way. So, for example, many of these damaged towns were seafront towns, very precariously built, roads that went by the sea, etc. And the idea, of course, was to now rebuild not only on safer grounds, but since these were seaside resorts, to also rebuild them in a way that could be attractive to tourists and give the local economy and give the local region a bit of an impetus. And this is where I think many of the plans failed. simply because it's an exercise that the institutions aren't prepared for, that they are not used to undertaking, and the idea of regular dialogue with the local population is not something that Chileans are particularly used to, or certainly that they weren't used to at the time in 2010. I think recent years where protests have taken to the streets and civil society has experienced something of a rebirth, social movements become very, very powerful in Chile in recent years. But all of that has happened since the earthquake. So in 2010, the civil society really was not as active, and there was no government that had any kind of experience of how to relate to this. Another thing that was important at the time was that about 2 weeks after the earthquake actually happened, there was a change in government. So for the first time in over 20 years, the centre-right took over the government, and this had a very, very significant impact on this entire process of reconstruction. Not only because on the one hand, a new government brings in new people. These new people didn't necessarily know how the institutions work. They didn't necessarily know how government works. They weren't familiar with the networks within government or with the tools that they could use. But also because with the centre right-wing government taking office, the idea of the private sector playing a greater role in this became much more prominent. And so again, that is something that neither the private sector nor the government nor civil society in Chile is particularly prepared for. These are not social actors that have had a fluid relationship in the last decades, and this is a civil society which is still very much driven by people who were for or against the dictatorship. The old wounds of history are still very much there. Having a new government take care of this at the time was also a complicating factor.
In looking at a situation like this, then, we can question if the overall impact of the quake will create the kind of critical juncture that can lead to significant political, social, institutional, and even economic shifts. Do you think this might have been such a juncture for Chile?
No, unfortunately it wasn't. I think the previous large earthquake in Chile, which had established an institution such as the CORFO, which is sort of a national development agency, in that sense was much more of a critical juncture. If at all, I think probably the earthquake, there's some interesting things of earthquake which have to do with civil society leadership and some of the leadership that we observed in the areas where we did a lot of field work. And one of the interesting things was that most civil society leaders whom we encountered, in fact, I'd say all of them, at least 99% of them, were women. And they took on a much more active role in organizing their communities, in taking on relationships with the local institutions, getting things done, making petitions, etc. And probably this organization of civil society in some shape or form probably also fed into subsequent years during which we witnessed more and more active civil society and social movements that actually came to a head during this same government, during the same Piñera government, the centre-right government, through the student protests, which became very, very prominent in 2011. So in that sense, the earthquake may have fed into a more active society, into generating a higher level of expectation among the population for dialogue, for being taken into account and not just being passed over by some government that did what it wanted to do. But unfortunately, what I can't see at the moment is the kind of critical juncture that comes out of a reconstruction effort that in some shape or form reorganizes not only how reconstruction is undertaken, but also combines this with some kind of long-term vision or planning for the country. I think that the idea of planning anything was very much anathema to the centre-right government at the time and didn't in any shape or form cross their policy priorities. They were just literally focused on getting the reconstruction done in terms of the numbers. So, as is very frequent in scenarios like this, the government is focused on the statistics of what it has achieved. So how many houses were built, over what period of time, how many schools have been rebuilt, how many hospitals have been rebuilt. And so when you look at the initial reports on the earthquake, it's all a case of people quoting numbers and showing how much they have achieved in a short space of time. It was really then down to the Bachelet government, which took office again in 2014, to reevaluate the post-earthquake scenario, to establish a commission to really find out what had gone on, how things were developing, and what state of affairs were, and in particular, to come up with a strategy that would deal with reconstruction efforts more effectively in the future. The person who headed this commission, I think, was very effective, did a tremendously a good job of bringing together the information, interviewing people, taking an in-depth analysis of what had happened. But the priorities of this government, again, have overwhelmingly centered on the large reforms that this Chile government has undertaken. And although I believe that there's been some improvement in terms of strengthening the organizations and the institutions that deal with reconstruction, in the long run, I don't see a paradigm shift in terms of how these institutions are structured and how they will work in the future. I do think that this earthquake has led to improvements in that sense, but probably not enough to prevent this kind of situation from happening again.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But thank you so much, Kristen, for providing us insight into the Chilean earthquake and sort of the dynamic landscape in Latin America.
Thank you very much.
And that is all the time that we have today. So thank you for listening. And please don't forget to add us on our social media accounts. So that's Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and now I believe YouTube. We started to post things on YouTube. So please follow us there and join us again in a few months for our issue for September. So hasta luego.